The culture of Hollywood is largely a negative one. I know because I used to work in the movie business in Los Angeles. And the stories of, after a few years of paying my dues and clinging to the career ladder, I looked around and realized that although we were in the entertainment business, nobody was having any fun. The stories that we would tell ourselves were largely those of exclusion, rejection, greed, or just luck. So, 5 years ago, I had my quarter-life crisis. Midlife crisisers might buy sports cars. Quarter-life crisisers go to India to find themselves. And I wasn't exactly sure. I had no goal in mind when I left. I just knew that I wanted to wake up in the morning with something to be excited about. And I certainly didn't want to be surrounded by those negative stories. Stories have a lot of power. And even though the term storytelling has become a darling of this information age and is much overused, we would be wise not to dismiss that power. What we know about who we are comes from the stories that we tell, not just the information we receive, but the stories we tell. Think for a moment. What kind of stories do you tell? What kind of stories do you listen to? And what do those stories say about the world that you live in? It's not just Hollywood that's drowning in negative stories. If you listen to our headlines or the entertainment or even our own complaining conversations, the world sucks. If what Harold Goddard said is true, that the destiny of the world is determined less by the battles lost and won than by the stories it loves and believes in, what should we be telling stories about? So my crisis sort of rounded a bend when I was given a book by a mentor. The title is a little overambitious for me at the time, but How to Change the World. I read it anyway, and it introduced me to the world of social entrepreneurship. Did you know that right now there are people all over the world who are actually solving problems? And not just treating the symptoms or applying a Band-Aid, but actually looking towards the root and having sustainable impact. And these are not the government programs or the charities that you might recognize, but generally just men, women, sometimes children who saw a problem in their community and decided that they would stop at nothing until they fixed it. And it's not just one or two, but potentially millions of them. These people are actual change makers. And when I started reading about their stories, I was amazed, and I was inspired, I was humbled, but I was also shocked. How had I not heard about any of these people before? This is what we should be telling stories about. This is what we should love and believe in. It's widely believed that storytelling evolved to aid our survival. Early humans used storytelling to share information about the hunt or to pass on valuable lessons. So we are literally wired for cause and effect, to look for storytelling. When information is given to us in the form of a story, we're more interested. And because we're more interested, we remember it. And because we remember it, it begins to shape how we see our world. One of the first great social entrepreneurs that I ever learned about was a man named Muhammad Yunus. In the 1970s in Bangladesh, Muhammad Yunus started a movement which is now known as microlending, lending small amounts of money, usually less than $100, to the poorest of the poor without collateral, and to allow them to make a purchase, to start a business, or to get out of debt, and to break the cycle of poverty. Muhammad Yunus's model has spread all across the globe. His work has impacted the way developmental aid is done forever. And he has impacted the lives of millions of people. But most people don't know about him. what does it say about our world if in the United States most people don't know who Muhammad Yunus is, but everybody knows who Casey Anthony is? So when I started learning about social entrepreneurs, it changed the way that I saw the world. And I decided then that I wanted to be a part of that movement. I wanted to get involved. But what could a directionless 20-something who had dropped out of the only career her communications degree was good for, how could I be of any use? But then it hit me. Maybe I could tell their stories. So in 2010, I traveled to Guatemala along with my husband and a small group of university students in order to test out an idea. What if we could make documentaries about changemakers? This is the Guatemalan coffee farmer family that we stayed with. Coffee farmers in Guatemala and all over the world often live in extreme poverty. And even though coffee is a very big business, very little of the profit trickles back down to the farmers themselves. The farmers spend years working on their fields, and then when harvest comes, they deliver the coffee fruit direct to the plantation. The plantation then takes that fruit, processes it, and then charges 100 times what they purchased the coffee fruit for to the end consumer. Coffee plantations or their distributors get rich, and the coffee farmers stay very poor. So in Guatemala, just outside of Antigua, there's a small town called San Miguel Escobar, and there's an organization called As Green As It Gets. They thought, what if we could teach coffee farmers how to process their own coffee and take it all the way to the end direct to consumer? What kind of impact would that have? And as they went about this idea, they started with one farmer, expanded to several more until it encompassed an entire community of coffee farmers not just growing the coffee, but multi-step processing and selling to the end consumer. And they were literally making 100 times more money than they had previously. Their work has transformed the lives of dozens of coffee farmers, their families, and the entire economy of San Miguel Escobar. That is a change maker and a really good story. In our time in Guatemala, we learned several things. We learned that change maker stories can make for great documentary films, that impact can be had from telling those stories, and most interestingly, everyone who was involved in the production of telling those stories, myself, my husband, and the students that we traveled with, our perspective was forever changed. So we thought that this was a pretty neat idea. And we thought, maybe we should do this more. Maybe we should do this all the time. So we packed up our belongings, got rid of our apartment, and for the last few years have been traveling the world with different groups of students making documentaries about changemakers. In Kenya, a group of students produced a film where they explored the problems of idle youth in the slums of Nairobi, and an organization called Slum Code that is dedicated to providing jobs training, mentorship, and a positive environment to youth that would otherwise be turning to gangs, drugs, and crime for lack of anything else to do. Telling their story would bring more recognition and rewards to Slum Code and allow them to expand their outreach and help more youth that would otherwise be on the street. In our travels to Turkey, another group of students produced a film about an organization called Zumbara. It's a time banking organization that's giving new life to the barter system. And they do this in order to build connections and community in the isolating big city of Istanbul. Telling their story could lead to the spread of Zumbara-like models, and we could see communities based in this alternative economy spring up in cities and towns all over the world. In our travels to Thailand, another group of students produced a film about the Children's Organization of Southeast Asia and its founder, Mickey Chutesa. Mickey is a Thai photographer who is now dedicated his life to combating child sex trafficking. And he does this not through busting down brothels, but through intervening in the communities where the girls are at risk and by providing education and support to stop the problem at its source. Telling this story could inspire a next generation of changemakers to look at an overwhelming problem and not give up hope, but maybe to try things differently. Those are just 3 of the dozens of documentaries that various groups of students have made over the last few years. The films are compelling, and we've begun to see impact from the stories, but the impact on the students is immediate. I recognize in them the same realization that I had when I first learned about social entrepreneurs, or when I first went to Guatemala. They begin to understand the power of these stories. They see value in telling them and leave us motivated to tell more. One of my biggest goals in the work that we do now is to build a band of storytellers armed with cameras out to reveal the good in our world. We need more people to tell these kinds of stories. Lucky for us, we're all storytellers. What we read, what we watch, it's what we think about, what we talk about, what we share. We perpetuate the stories we consume, and each one of these stories has power. There's a much referenced idea that if you want to be successful, you need to surround yourself with successful people. Well, I think it is just as important that if you want to be motivated, inspired, and hopeful, you need to surround yourself with those kinds of stories. Perhaps one of the biggest impacts of telling these stories that matter is that it could restore our faith in humanity and remind us that even today, anything is possible. We can solve our problems. At this point in my life, I find myself at yet another turning point. It might be difficult to tell in this light, but I am expecting, and my husband and I will have our first child in December. And as we think about what it's like to be new parents, we think about what we want for our child. And there's the immediate concerns: a safe delivery, a loving home, enough diapers. But then there are my hopes for the future. And I hope that my child will be surrounded by positive stories. I hope that the most popular entertainment, books, movies, television, will not just entertain, but inspire my child to greatness. And I hope that my child is immersed in conversations, both online and offline, that frame problems not as reasons to give up, but as opportunities for innovation. And I hope that in whatever format the news is delivered, that my child will learn not just about what's going wrong in the world, but about people who are doing things very, very right. I hope that my child will join our band of storytellers, and I hope you will too. This event was inspired by the mission, Ideas Worth Spreading. We are all storytellers, and if we're serious about changing the world, we have a responsibility to tell stories that matter. Thank you.